I'll never forget the way she said it. Her voice steady, almost too calm, as though she'd rehearsed it in front of a mirror. "Lucas," she began, not meeting my eyes. "I think I need freedom." Freedom? The word struck me like a slap, and for a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. We were sitting in the living room, our living room, the same place where we laughed over bad movies, where Sophie learned to crawl, where Ethan built forts out of pillows and blankets. And now, here she was, turning our life into some kind of ambiguous monologue about finding herself. What does that even mean? I finally asked, my voice harsher than I intended. She hesitated, looking everywhere but at me. I feel trapped, Lucas. I love you, but I feel like I'm missing something. I need space to figure out who I am." I felt the air grow heavy, like someone had sucked the oxygen out of the room. "Missing something?" I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "Emma, we've been married for 10 years. We have a family. You don't just wake up one day and decide you're missing something. What are you really trying to say?" Her face flushed, and for the first time, her calm facade cracked. "I don't know, okay? I don't know how to explain it. I just need freedom to explore things, to figure out what I want." Her vagueness made my skin crawl. Explore things? Are we talking about a hobby here, Emma? Or are you saying you want to see other people? Silence. That damned silence. And then, she looked up at me, her eyes glossy but defiant. "Maybe. I don't know." It was like someone had poured ice water down my spine. My wife, the mother of my children, my partner, the woman I had built a life with, was standing here, telling me she wanted to keep our marriage but somehow have her freedom, too. I felt anger rise in my chest, hot and unrelenting. "So, you're saying you want the benefits of marriage but without the commitment? Without loyalty?" My voice was shaking now, but I didn't care. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not what I'm saying. Why do you have to make it sound so black and white?" "Because it is black and white, Emma." I shot back. "Either you're committed to this family, or you're not. There's no middle ground here." Her face crumpled, and for a split second, I thought I saw guilt. But then she folded her arms, her posture stiffening. "You don't understand what it's like to feel suffocated, Lucas. To feel like you've lost yourself." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Suffocated? Emma, I've given you everything. We've built a life together. This house, our kids. And you feel suffocated?" I didn't recognize the woman standing in front of me. This wasn't the same Emma who held my hand in the hospital room when Sophie was born, who laughed with me over burnt pancakes on Sunday mornings, who used to dance with me in the kitchen just because a good song came on the radio. She looked away again, and that's when I knew. I didn't have all the pieces yet, but I could feel it in my gut. There was more to this. She wasn't just lost or missing something. There was something, or someone else. The rest of the argument was a blur of shouting and accusations. At one point, Sophie and Ethan peeked down the stairs, their wide eyes filled with confusion. I forced myself to lower my voice, but the damage was done. The seeds of distrust had already been planted. That night, as Emma slept in the guest room, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her words played on a loop in my head. Freedom, space, missing something. I didn't know exactly what was happening yet, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let her destroy our family without a fight. They say your gut never lies. That nagging voice in the back of my mind had been screaming ever since Emma dropped her bombshell about needing freedom. But nothing could have prepared me for the avalanche of truth that would come crashing down. It started with her phone. I'd never been the kind of husband to snoop, but after her vague confession, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Emma had always been glued to her phone, but now it was constant, quickly tucking it away when I walked into the room, the sly smiles when a notification popped up. It was like watching someone try to hide a flame in a dark room. The more she tried to conceal it, the more obvious it became. One night, as she showered, I made my move. Her phone was on the kitchen counter, screen down. My hands trembled as I picked it up, not even sure what I was looking for. I didn't have to search long. A single notification flashed on the screen. "Can't stop thinking about earlier. When can I see you again?" My stomach twisted into a knot. I opened the thread, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might wake the kids upstairs. The texts weren't just flirtatious. They were explicit, detailed. Messages exchanged with a man named Evan, someone I'd never heard of before. The timestamps revealed this wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This had been going on for weeks, maybe months. But it wasn't just the texts. There were emails, too, long, gushing exchanges about how alive he made her feel, how he understood her in ways I never could. Each word felt like a dagger, twisting deeper into my chest. And then there were photos. Not inappropriate ones, thank God, but intimate. Selfies at a cafe. A blurry shot of a sunset I now realized wasn't taken with me but with him. I put the phone down, my hands shaking. I felt like I was on fire, my face hot with anger and humiliation. Every fiber of my being wanted to storm upstairs, yank her out of the shower, and demand an explanation. But then I thought of Sophie and Ethan, sleeping soundly in their beds. I couldn't let them see me unravel. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the evidence of her betrayal glowing on the screen. My mind raced with questions. Who was this guy? Where had she met him? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, why? Was I not enough? Had I missed some glaring sign that our marriage was falling apart? I couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called in sick to work, pretending I had the flu. Emma barely noticed, too preoccupied with her errands. She kissed the kids goodbye and left the house without even looking at me. That was when I started digging deeper. Social media was a goldmine of clues. Emma's accounts were public, and while most of her posts were innocuous, pictures of the kids, inspirational quotes about finding balance, there were likes and comments from Evan. His profile was private, but his profile picture was enough to send a fresh wave of rage through me. He was younger, flashier, the kind of guy who probably thought marriage was an outdated institution. Then came the emails. I hacked into her laptop that night, using the password I'd seen her type 100 times before. The inbox told a story of romantic dinners, secret meetups, even excuses she'd made to cover her tracks. It was all there in black and white, proof of how little she thought of me, of our family. By the time Emma came home that night, I had a folder saved on my computer, labeled simply, evidence. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. I knew I needed to bide my time, to gather everything I could before I made my move. This wasn't just about her betrayal anymore. This was about protecting my kids, my future. As I watched her laugh with Sophie and Ethan that evening, a strange calm settled over me. She didn't know I knew. She didn't know what was coming. And that gave me power. The seeds of distrust had sprouted into something darker, something unrelenting. I wasn't just going to let her betray me. I was going to make sure she paid for it. The worst part about betrayal isn't the act itself. It's the silence that follows. The way you carry on as if nothing has changed when, deep down, you know your entire world is teetering on the edge of collapse. That's exactly where I found myself after uncovering Emma's secrets. I decided to play the long game. She didn't know I'd seen the texts, the emails, or the pictures, and that ignorance was my weapon. If I confronted her too soon, she'd deny everything or, worse, twist the narrative to make me the bad guy. No, I needed more, something undeniable. So, I became an observer in my own home, silently watching the woman I'd once trusted with my heart. It was maddening how easily she slipped between roles. One moment, she was a doting mother, helping Sophie with her homework and laughing at Ethan's goofy jokes. The next, she was glued to her phone, her face lighting up with that telltale smile I now knew wasn't for me. It was like living with a stranger who wore my wife's face but had a heart that no longer belonged to me. The lies started to pile up. "I'm meeting Lisa for coffee," she'd say, grabbing her purse and rushing out the door. Lisa, her best friend, who I was sure would rather chew glass than lie for her. Or, "I have a late meeting at work," despite her job being as predictable as clockwork. The excuses were flimsy, but I nodded along, playing the part of the clueless husband. I started keeping a journal, something to ground me as I navigated this surreal double life. Every lie, every suspicious outing, every unexplained purchase. I documented it all. It wasn't just for my sanity. It was for the moment I'd inevitably need to lay it all out in black and white. Then there were the little details. Emma wasn't as careful as she thought. Receipts left crumpled in her purse, hinting at lunches and dinners she hadn't mentioned. Perfume I didn't recognize lingering on her clothes. Once, I found a movie ticket stub in her car for a film she claimed to have no interest in seeing. Each clue was another nail in the coffin of our marriage, another piece of the puzzle that painted a picture I wished I could unsee. The hardest part was the nights. Lying in bed next to her, pretending everything was normal, felt like torture. I could hear her breathing, steady and peaceful, while my mind raced with images of her with him. I'd stare at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our life together, searching for the moment things went wrong. Was it something I'd done? Or was this just who she'd become? Despite the storm raging inside me, I remained calm on the surface. I went to work, helped the kids with their routines, and even made small talk with Emma over dinner. It was all a facade, but it was necessary. I needed her to believe she was still in control, that I hadn't pieced it all together. But every calm has its cracks. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her lips curving into that smile again, and my stomach churned. I forced myself to look away, pretending to be engrossed in the show, but inside, I was screaming. "Who's that?" I asked casually, keeping my voice light. She barely looked up. "Oh, just Lisa. She's asking about plans for the weekend." "Tell her I said hi," I said, forcing a smile. She nodded, already typing a reply, oblivious to the fact that I knew she was lying. Every moment like that fueled my resolve. She thought she was in control, that I was blind to her betrayal. But she didn't realize I was 2 steps ahead, quietly gathering the pieces I needed to confront her, not with anger, but with undeniable truth. As the days turned into weeks, I became numb to the pain. It wasn't that it didn't hurt anymore. It did, in ways I couldn't describe. But I'd channeled that pain into purpose. I wasn't just a victim of her betrayal. I was the architect of her reckoning. She thought she was playing me. She had no idea I was playing her right back. If there's one thing betrayal teaches you, it's patience. The kind of patience that allows you to sit quietly in the shadows while your entire world crumbles around you. That's where I found myself, watching Emma weave a web of lies, all while pretending I hadn't already seen the threads unraveling. The day I finally got my proof was both devastating and clarifying. Emma had left the house in her usual whirlwind, claiming she had errands to run. But something in her tone that morning felt different, lighter, almost giddy. I could tell by the way she kissed Sophie on the head, distractedly waved goodbye to Ethan, and avoided meeting my eyes as she left. It was as if she couldn't get out the door fast enough. I followed her. I'd thought about it before but hadn't had the nerve. This time, I knew I couldn't just sit back and let her lies go unchecked. I kept a safe distance, my heart pounding as I tailed her car through the city streets. She didn't notice me. I'd learned to be invisible in her world. She pulled into a cafe parking lot and stepped out, her posture relaxed, her face glowing, with an excitement I hadn't seen in years. She wasn't meeting Lisa, that much I knew. I parked across the street, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Minutes later, a man joined her at an outdoor table. Him, Evan. Even from a distance, I could see their connection, the way she leaned toward him, her laugh too loud, too carefree. It was a version of Emma I hadn't seen in years, and it wasn't for me. My chest tightened as they chatted, their heads close together, their smiles too intimate for friends. I pulled out my phone, my hands trembling as I snapped picture after picture. It felt wrong, invasive even, but I reminded myself why I was doing this. This wasn't just about me. This was about protecting my children, my home, my future. Proof. I needed undeniable proof. After about 40 minutes, they left the cafe, walking side by side down the street. I stayed in my car, following at a distance as they wandered into a nearby park. The sight of them holding hands hit me like a punch to the gut. My wife, my Emma, was walking with this stranger as though they were the ones building a life together. They stopped at a secluded bench under a cluster of trees. He pulled her close, his hand brushing her cheek, and she didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her face lighting up in a way that made me feel like a ghost. Then it happened. The kiss. It wasn't a fleeting peck or a hesitant gesture. It was deliberate, passionate, the kind of kiss that said everything words couldn't. I couldn't watch anymore. I snapped one last photo and drove away, my vision blurred by the rage and heartbreak swirling inside me. I pulled over a few blocks away and just sat there, my breathing uneven, my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. This was no longer speculation or suspicion. I had seen it with my own eyes. The woman I had shared a life with, the mother of my children, had betrayed me in the most visceral, undeniable way. That night, I didn't speak a word to her. She came home, smiling like nothing had happened, kissing Sophie on the forehead and helping Ethan with his school project. It was like watching a stranger play a role in my family's life, and I had to sit there and let her perform. But inside, I was done. The pain had hardened into something else, something sharper, more focused. I was no longer the passive observer, gathering scraps of evidence. I had what I needed. Now, it was time to plan my next move. She thought she was in control, but what she didn't know was that I had already begun writing the final chapter of this charade. And when the time came, I would make sure the story ended on my terms. After Emma walked out that night, I knew I had crossed the point of no return. There was no turning back now, not for her and certainly not for me. My priority was clear: protect Sophie and Ethan, no matter what it took. They didn't deserve to be caught in the fallout of their mother's selfishness. And so, the next morning, I began the process of securing our future. I called the lawyer I'd been researching for weeks, a no-nonsense professional named Elaine Carter. She came highly recommended for cases like mine, messy divorces with kids involved. I didn't want drama, but I wanted to be prepared for anything Emma might try to pull. Elaine's office was stark and professional, with dark wood paneling and shelves lined with legal books. As I sat across from her desk, I laid everything on the table, literally. I handed her the folder of evidence I'd collected, feeling both a pang of humiliation and a surge of resolve. "You've done your homework," she said, flipping through the pages. Her tone was approving, but her expression stayed neutral. "This is going to make things a lot easier. With evidence like this, we can establish her as the one at fault, which puts you in a strong position for custody, property division, and financial support." I nodded, my jaw tight. "I just want to make sure my kids are taken care of. They're my priority." "And the house?" she asked. "I want to keep it," I said firmly. "This is their home. They've already been through enough upheaval. I won't let them lose that too." Elaine nodded, jotting down notes. "With the evidence you've provided, I don't see any reason why we can't secure full custody in the house. Have you considered alimony or child support?" The thought of taking money from Emma felt strange, but I knew it wasn't about me. It was about the kids. "If it's for Sophie and Ethan, then yes," I said. "But this isn't about revenge. I just want what's fair." "Understood," she said. "Now, let's talk strategy." Over the next hour, we mapped out a plan. Elaine would file for divorce on the grounds of infidelity, which would put me in a favorable position. She advised me to stay calm and civil, no matter how messy things got. "The court favors stability," she explained. "You need to show that you're the steady, reliable parent." I left her office feeling a strange mix of emotions: relief, anger, sadness, and a quiet determination. This wasn't how I'd envisioned my life going, but I was done mourning the past. Now, it was about building a future for my kids and me. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, meetings, and quiet preparations. I started compiling financial records, making sure every detail was accounted for. I couldn't leave anything to chance, not when it came to Sophie and Ethan. Emma, for her part, didn't make things easy. She called sporadically, sometimes tearful, sometimes defiant. One minute she'd beg to come back, claiming she'd made a mistake. The next, she'd accuse me of being controlling, of pushing her away. I refused to engage. Every conversation was short and to the point, focused solely on the logistics of the kids. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me anymore. Sophie and Ethan were the hardest part. They asked questions I couldn't fully answer. Why Mommy wasn't home, why she seemed so sad when they saw her. I tried to shield them as much as I could, reassuring them that they were loved and that everything would be okay. It wasn't easy, but their resilience amazed me. Somehow, despite everything, they still found reasons to laugh, to play, to be kids. They were my anchor, keeping me grounded in the storm. By the time the first court date arrived, I was ready. Elaine had prepped me for every possible scenario, and I walked into that courtroom with my head held high. Emma looked different, tired, anxious, but still defiant. She didn't speak much, letting her lawyer do most of the talking. But when it came time to present the evidence, her confidence faltered. The texts, the emails, the photos, it was all there, laid out for the court to see. Emma's lawyer tried to spin it, claiming she was unfulfilled and that the marriage had been struggling for years. But the judge wasn't buying it. The facts spoke for themselves, and Elaine made sure they were impossible to ignore. By the end of the hearing, I had secured temporary custody of Sophie and Ethan, along with the house. The final arrangements would take time, but I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as I left the courtroom that day. For the first time in months, I felt like I was taking control of my life again. Emma was no longer the woman I'd built my life with, but she was still the mother of my children. I knew there would be challenges ahead, but I was ready to face them. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about rebuilding, one step at a time. The day Emma left for good felt surreal, like a moment I dreaded for so long that I didn't realize how ready I was for it to finally arrive. I thought there would be a storm of emotions, anger, sadness, maybe even regret. But what I felt, more than anything, was relief. She came over in the afternoon to pack her things. I'd made sure Sophie and Ethan were out with my parents for the day. They didn't need to see this. They didn't need to watch their mother walk out of the house we'd built together, the home they'd grown up in, and know it was because she'd chosen someone else over us. When Emma walked through the door, she looked hesitant, almost embarrassed. "I just want to get this over with," she said, avoiding my gaze. "Take whatever you need," I replied, my voice steady. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me crack. Not now. She headed upstairs without another word, and I stood in the living room, listening to the sounds of her moving through the house. The creak of the floorboards in our bedroom. The soft scrape of hangers being pulled from the closet. It was strange, hearing her in a space that had once felt like ours and realizing it wasn't anymore. That chapter of our lives was over, and there was no going back. I stayed downstairs, not because I wanted to avoid her, but because I didn't trust myself to watch her pack. I didn't want to see her handle the pieces of our life together like they were just things. Just clothes, just photos, just memories she no longer needed. After about an hour, she came back down, carrying a couple of suitcases. She set them by the door and looked at me, her expression a mix of guilt and defiance. "Lucas," she started, but I cut her off. "You don't have to say anything," I said. "It's done." She hesitated, her eyes searching mine for something. Maybe forgiveness, maybe understanding. I wasn't sure, and I didn't care. Whatever she was looking for, she wasn't going to find it here. "I didn't mean for things to end like this," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Emma, you didn't just hurt me. You shattered everything. You hurt me, the kids, our family. And for what? Some guy who'll probably leave you the second things get hard?" Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But she didn't. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and nodded. "I made mistakes," she admitted. "But I still love Sophie and Ethan. I want to be in their lives." "That's not up to me anymore," I said coldly. "That's up to the court. You made your choices, Emma. Now you have to live with them." She stood there for a moment, as if waiting for me to say something else. When I didn't, she picked up her suitcases and walked out the door. I followed her to the porch, watching as she loaded her things into the car. She paused before getting in, looking back at me one last time. "I hope, someday, you'll be able to forgive me," she said. I didn't reply. I just stood there, watching as she got in the car and drove away. The sound of the engine faded into the distance, leaving only silence in its wake. When I walked back inside, the house felt emptier, quieter. But it also felt lighter, like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I walked through the house, taking in the spaces she'd left behind. Her side of the closet was empty. Her perfume no longer lingered in the air, and the house felt different, strangely new. This was my home now, my space, the kids' space. And while it wasn't the life I'd imagined, it was a fresh start. That night, I tucked Sophie and Ethan into bed, reassuring them that everything was going to be okay. They asked about their mom, and I kept my answers simple. "She's staying somewhere else for now," I said, "but you'll see her soon." They accepted it, their trust in me unwavering. And as I watched them drift off to sleep, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. For me, for the kids, for all of us. Emma was gone, but we were still here. And that was enough to start rebuilding. If there's one thing I learned in the aftermath of Emma's departure, it's that kids are far more resilient than we give them credit for. Sophie and Ethan, despite their young age, seemed to have an unshakable ability to adapt. Their laughter, though tinged with moments of confusion, became the soundtrack of our days. And for me, their resilience became my anchor. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments. Mornings were the hardest. Emma used to handle breakfasts while I prepared for work. Now, I found myself juggling pancakes, school lunches, and getting them out the door on time, all while trying to navigate my own emotions. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that made it worth it. Sophie, my oldest, was the first to ask the hard questions. "Dad," she said one evening as we sat on the couch, "is Mom coming back?" I paused, unsure how to answer without betraying my own feelings. "Mom loves you," I said carefully, "but things are going to be different now. She won't be living here anymore." Her face fell, her little hands fidgeting with the hem of her pajama shirt. Did I do something wrong? That question shattered me. I pulled her close, holding her tighter than I probably should have. "No, sweetheart. None of this is your fault. Not even a little bit. Sometimes, adults make choices that affect everyone, and it's not fair. But I promise you, I'll always be here for you and Ethan." She nodded against my chest, her small arms wrapping around me. It was in that moment I realized how much they needed me to stay steady, to be their rock. No matter how broken I felt, I couldn't let them see it. They needed to know they were safe, loved, and that this was still their home. Ethan, on the other hand, expressed his feelings in smaller ways. He became more clingy, following me around the house, asking if I'd still be there when he woke up. His innocence, his need for reassurance, only strengthened my resolve to give them a sense of normalcy. To rebuild those bonds, I knew I had to create new traditions, new memories that were just ours. Friday nights became pizza and movie night. We'd spread a blanket on the living room floor, order a pizza, and take turns picking a movie. Sophie leaned toward animated adventures, while Ethan loved anything with talking animals. Watching their faces light up during those nights made the chaos of our days feel worth it. On weekends, I started taking them to the park. Ethan loved the swings, his laughter echoing as I pushed him higher and higher. Sophie would sit beside me on the bench, asking questions about school, her friends, and sometimes, cautiously, about her mom. I answered honestly but gently, always bringing the focus back to the present. "We're going to be okay," I'd tell her. "I promise." Of course, there were moments of doubt. Nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was enough for them. Could I be both parents? Could I give them everything they needed without falling apart myself? Those thoughts haunted me, but every time I saw them smile, every time they ran to me with open arms, I knew I couldn't afford to give in to those fears. The house, once a painful reminder of Emma's absence, began to feel like our own. We redecorated together, choosing new curtains for the living room and letting Sophie and Ethan pick posters for their rooms. It was a small thing, but it gave them a sense of control, a way to reclaim their space. Over time, I noticed a change in myself too. The anger I'd carried, the bitterness that had consumed me, started to fade. Instead, I felt a deep sense of purpose. My life wasn't about Emma anymore. It was about Sophie and Ethan. They were my future, my reason to keep moving forward. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, Sophie looked up at me and said, "You're doing a good job, Dad." Her words caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked, smiling. "You're taking care of us," she said simply. "I know it's hard, but you're doing great." I had to look away for a moment, my eyes stinging with unexpected tears. "Thanks, kiddo," I said, my voice thick. "That means a lot." It wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, moments when the weight of everything felt like too much. But those moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the love and laughter that filled our home. We were rebuilding, not just a family but a sense of belonging, of hope. This wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the one I had now. And as long as Sophie and Ethan were by my side, I knew we could make it through anything, together. Life has a strange way of surprising you, even when you think you've seen it all. After everything with Emma, I wasn't sure I could ever open my heart again. I wasn't even sure I wanted to. My world revolved around Sophie and Ethan now, and that was enough. Or so I thought. It started innocently enough, as most things do. Lily had been a colleague for years, someone I barely noticed beyond the occasional good morning in the office or polite chatter during meetings. She was always kind, with a warm smile that seemed to brighten the dreariest of days. But after the divorce, I began to notice her more, not because I was looking, but because she was there, quietly offering support in ways I hadn't expected. It began with a simple question one morning at work. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her eyes filled with genuine concern. I hesitated, unsure how much to say. "It's been a lot," I admitted, "but I'm managing. The kids keep me grounded." Her smile was soft, understanding. "You're a good dad, Lucas. They're lucky to have you." Those words stayed with me longer than they should have. In a world where I constantly questioned if I was doing enough, hearing someone affirm it felt like a balm to my frayed nerves. Over the weeks that followed, our conversations became more frequent. They started at work, but gradually extended to coffee breaks and occasional texts. Lily had a way of listening that made you feel seen, like your words mattered. She never pried, never pushed. She just cared. And in the quiet chaos of my life, that care was something I hadn't realized I needed. One evening, as I was wrangling Sophie and Ethan through their bedtime routine, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Lily. "Hope you're having a good evening. Let me know if you ever need someone to talk to." I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Gratitude, curiosity, and something else. A warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. I hesitated before replying, "Thanks, Lily. That means a lot." The days turned into weeks, and our friendship grew. She never overstepped, always respecting the boundaries I'd unconsciously set. But there was something about her. Her kindness, her patience, her ability to make me laugh even on the worst days, that made it impossible not to let her in. One Friday evening, after dropping the kids off at my parents' for the weekend, I found myself sitting across from Lily at a small cafe. It wasn't a date, not officially, but it felt different from our usual chats at work. She asked about Sophie and Ethan, genuinely interested in their little quirks and stories. I told her about Sophie's newfound love for painting and Ethan's obsession with dinosaurs, and she listened with that same quiet attentiveness that made me feel like the only person in the room. As the evening went on, I realized how easy it was to be around her. There were no expectations, no pressure. Just two people sharing a moment, unburdened by the weight of the past. For the first time in months, I felt light. When I walked her to her car that night, she turned to me with a smile that was equal parts shy and confident. "You're doing an amazing job, Lucas," she said. "Don't ever doubt that." Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. "Thanks, Lily. I finally managed. You have no idea how much that means." She hesitated, as if debating whether to say something more, but then she just nodded and got into her car. I watched her drive away, my heart heavy with something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. The next morning, as I played with Sophie and Ethan in the backyard, I couldn't help but think of Lily. She wasn't a replacement for Emma, not even close, but she was different. She reminded me that there was still goodness in the world, still people who saw value in kindness and connection. And maybe, just maybe, there was room in my life for that again. It wasn't a new love story. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something. Something I wasn't ready to name but couldn't ignore. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I felt like the future wasn't just a question mark. It was a promise, waiting to be written. It's strange how life shifts without you realizing it. One day, you're drowning in grief, weighed down by betrayal and anger, and then, almost imperceptibly, the weight begins to lift. That's how it felt as I stood on the back porch, watching Sophie and Ethan chase each other around the yard. Their laughter rang out, filling the space that had once felt so empty. In that moment, I realized something. I had survived. The house felt like home again. It wasn't just a collection of walls holding memories of what once was. It was a sanctuary for what was now and what was yet to come. Sophie had taken up painting in earnest, her artwork covering the fridge and the walls of her room. Ethan, ever the explorer, had turned the backyard into a miniature archaeological dig, complete with plastic dinosaurs buried in the dirt. They thrived, and in their joy, I found my own. Lily became a quiet but constant presence in our lives. Not intrusive, never overstepping, but there when I needed her. She joined us for a picnic one weekend, a simple outing that turned into a memory I would cherish. Watching her help Ethan build a sandcastle while Sophie explained the intricacies of her latest painting project felt right. Not in the way things had been with Emma, but in a way that felt steady, uncomplicated, and new. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, reflecting on how far we'd come. My phone buzzed, a message from Lily. "How's the dinosaur dig going?" I chuckled, typing back. "Ethan says he's discovered a new species. Might have to call the museum." Her reply came quickly. "Sounds groundbreaking. Keep me posted." There was no pressure in her words, no expectation, just warmth. And I realized, with a clarity that startled me, that I wanted more of that warmth in my life. I didn't want to rush into anything. For Sophie and Ethan's sake, I needed to take things slowly. But for the first time in a long while, I could see the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by loss or betrayal. A future that held hope, laughter, and maybe even love. One night, as I tucked Sophie into bed, she looked up at me with her big, questioning eyes. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" she asked. I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We already are," I said. "We're better than okay." It wasn't just words. I believed it. The hurt Emma had caused would always be a part of my story, but it didn't have to define it. I'd built something stronger out of the wreckage, a life filled with purpose, joy, and a love for my children that couldn't be shaken. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about the road ahead. It wouldn't be perfect, life never is, but it would be ours. And that was enough. Tomorrow held promise, not because of what it might bring, but because I was finally ready to embrace it. For Sophie, for Ethan, and for myself, I would keep moving forward. Not as a man who had been broken, but as one who had been rebuilt, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next.